disciplines, including where we study the entire range of disciplines, including the humanities, social sciences, mathematics, and creative arts. This liberal arts background in a wide variety of disciplines outside of architecture led to my keen interest in lateral thinking, where other disciplines can be engaged to inspire architecture in unexpected ways. When I completed my postgraduate degree in architecture at Yale, I studied under John Haydick, who shared very similar views to my own. As Lucas mentioned, my very first job after school was in an architecture firm in Rome, where, because of my background, I was hired to design an allegorical Tower of Science in Riyadh, the capital city of Saudi Arabia. From there, I next worked in Sydney, Australia, followed by Richard Meyer's office, after which I was then hired as the vice president of Emilio Ambas and Associates in New York. This was a particularly important event in my engagement with lateral thinking, and I'll show you some images as to why. Emilio Ambas was the curator. You can see the image, yeah?
There. Yes, I can see we can see the image. There we go.
Perfect. Emilio Ambas was the curator design for the Museum of Modern Art. And for that reason, every project we produced in the office looked at architecture in completely unexpected ways, something we called the poetics of the pragmatics. The most well-known design from our firm is the House of Spiritual Retreat, which was built in Cordoba, Spain. Our firm reflected upon how a house might be defined without a traditional roof or walls or even windows, but instead how it might be defined by its threshold, the gateway from an exterior realm to an internal one. And when I became an academic, I tried to bring all these insights into my teaching. I was asked by Lucas to speak here today because many of you, students and teachers, have asked me how my students come up with such unexpected ideas for architecture. My method is to introduce my students to prompts or generators that are not architecture and ask them how these prompts might inspire a new way of conceiving architectural form. I'll begin this talk by showing you 4 recordings where I interview 4 of my students about how they conceive designs that avoid architecture becoming a generic traditional box. Arriving at unexpected new ideas for architecture requires unexpected starting points. These starting points can also contribute to the appropriate functioning of the building. But a true work of architecture extends beyond well-resolved building performance. It also conveys meaning, and lateral thinking is the key. In this seminar, 4 students will discuss how their published or award-winning student projects engender meaning through lateral thinking. The first student is Jonathan Warish, and his 5th-year thesis design for an apartment complex titled Tarongawewe, Place to Stand, was generated from a Maori genealogy stick.
So this is my site that I've chosen for my thesis. This site is a 12-story apartment building on top of the ruins of the Te Aro Park, which occupied the whole of the Wellington waterfront prior to colonisation. This sort of triggered the whole provocation of how could I reveal the soul of the building or tell a story about this art site beneath it. And it was quite a challenging site, obviously, to not design as a box because it's literally a square site. I chose to use this idea of the Raka Whakapapa to create an idea where I could make spaces in a building that responded to time and the past site beneath it. And basically this Raka Whakapapa is Maori genealogy stick. So the orator, the older member of the tribe usually has one of these, and each notch represents their elder prior to them. So it's sort of the genealogy of your ancestors, and as the orator holds it, it's symbolism that the ancestors before them are standing there to help you stand as you continue on the knowledge that they've contributed to. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of notion. What if architecture was to take on this role of almost encapsulating generations prior to it to show that those are the foundation for what it's standing upon? So then I moved into this drawing here, which on the left-hand side, it's sort of looking at the genealogy of the site prior to colonization. And this is sort of the formation of the Rako Whakapapa, this vertical element up the side. And instead of being notches on a stick, it becomes volumes in a sort of vertical fashion. This whole drawing experiment here is just sort of looking at the changes that occurred to the site and almost putting two different eras of the site's identity in direct opposition to each other. I'll move on to my model now. And just to say, this model is nowhere near finished yet.
You actually built this model in about a day, didn't you?
Yeah, so these models that I build, they don't take that long, even though they look really detailed, but it's kind of about, I guess this approach to design that I'm going to talk to you about, which avoids the box.
The first thing you did was you made sure that you were not going to just start with one mass. So never start with massing and never start with plan. So you conceive this in section rather than plan.
Yeah, so basically, this is, I guess, a speculative design for what I'm going to try and now make it a little bit more, I guess, what you'd consider pragmatic towards that apartment building. But the notion here is that, we've got a Rako Whakapapa, literally an architectural one sitting here, and that becomes the sort of the public spaces of the flats. So it's the front face to the street, and it's all about that, I guess, like duality between the public and the private, and symbolizing time in the vertical. And then I'm always thinking about what, I guess, the cause and effect. When you're designing something, you're not trying to just be like, okay, extrude that out there, but be like, if I extrude that out there, for what reason am I extruding it out there? And the subtleties in here would probably be the structural thing, which is actually services being supplied to the building, but it's meant to sort of push up on this and feel like it's really leaning forward and putting its sort of face out to the street. Whereas on the back end, it's kind of more masked and concealed. And I mean, you can see the one thing I haven't even looked at this building in plan once. And that's because at this point it's heavily conceptual. So it's not as much about resolving the plan as it is about resolving the concept and the argument that I'm going with. So I don't let my spaces take over my thinking in the initial stages of design, I guess.
I just wanted to summarize quickly what Jonathan was saying and add a little more to it. What you noticed here was that he was definitely conscious of structure and mechanical, and he was using them both in ways that would help promote the narrative. So, for instance, he has what he would call a dual inhabitants of his site. The Rako Whakapapa is standing like a proud sentinel with her arms straight out on one side facing the street. A second inhabitant of that site is a wider, lower inhabitant for the back of the site, which in fact will be all the private spaces of the apartments. And he uses structure to make it look as if once upon a time, those two components may well have been touching, but they have moved away from one another. And you can see the structure stretching as the Rako Whakapapa has moved forward away from the torso behind it. And the other thing he showed you in his model was that, in fact, the structure read differently on the north face than it did on the south face. So it was two different stories of how structure was implying this movement over time. And implying movement over time is a wonderful expression to write down for yourself and to keep in mind when you're designing a narrative building. That's what Jonathan meant by the expression cause and effect. The effect of that stretched triangular truss system of structure. The implied cause, is the Rock-Out Whakapapa moving forward. So he's doing cause and effect as a way to establish form in space. The three main ways he started were, number one, he did not start with massing a building that he then tried to chip away at, because I think he'll tell you that never, ever works. Once you have a box on the site, it's really hard to get out of that trap. Number two is he did not start in plan, but instead he started with an idea about private spaces and public spaces, and he gave them each a separate identity on the site. The next thing he did after avoiding massing and avoiding plan and avoiding extrusion was he decided that in order to make architecture feel dynamic rather than just static and boring, he made sure that he started with asymmetry. And you can see how the big piece at the back versus the Rock-Out Whakapapa tall and narrow at the front is asymmetry. You can also see the arms coming out of the Rock-Out Whakapapa form asymmetry, so that he created asymmetry on all sides of the site. That was a way to make it really dynamic. And one of the things, the expression Jono used, is to build with faces rather than solids. Once you had that model, you then created this drawing. This drawing has a lot of narrative going on in it that is not apparent in the model. He's actually doing a narrative about architectural drawing. And you can see that the fact that his building had two grids, he's actually showing that as the sky is the concept of the building, which in fact is a canted grid against an orthogonal grid. And you've placed an opening in the ground as if this building was born below the earth and arose up out of the earth in order to appear. And so that goes to the heart of the Rock-Out Whakapapa, but that also goes to the heart of a three-dimensional model coming up out of a piece of paper and evolving three-dimensionally. And then a lot of your pencil scratches and scribbles are appearing on this, so that we begin to see the conceptual basis of the project as originating from a drawing is happening as well. My idea of inviting Jonathan was that by listening to someone who wasn't doing this kind of design at all a year ago today, not at all, he's fresh enough to it to know how he managed to figure it out. And a lot of it's about avoiding boxes and avoiding volumes and avoiding extrusions so that you're building with pieces, building some of the case studies that you love so that you can tear them apart, use them as toys, or press them or constrict them and make them your own. And looking at really beautiful architectural drawings and asking how you might reconceive an architectural drawing you love into a three-dimensional architectural design expression so that you're translating drawing into this, it won't be an extrusion at all. And then from always demanding that this face we're seeing here will not look the same as the other face. So there's really a dynamic intrigue going on. And he's absolutely using program, structure, and mechanical. Those three truths are absolutely the drivers of these forms. Anything that deals with water and cleansing might be in the Rock-Out Whakapapa. Anything dealing with large open areas for sleeping might be in the larger volume behind. So we move from the services into the private back and forth across bridges. And Jonathan is doing this after just 1 year of teaching himself how to do it. When Jonathan started doing this project, the first thing I asked him to do was just put a modular person there. He put in a modular person, and immediately it started bringing it into scale for himself. Next, we began to look at, this is an apartment building. So in an apartment building, if you were doing spatial diagram, you might show a rectangle like this, for the kitchen, and like that for the bathroom, and like this for the combined living room, 2-bedroom. And so by knowing that, it then allows you to know a relative volume for these two shapes. And that's all you need to know. Because once you know you have enough volume for the program, forget about it then and allow it to be situated in later on once the whole thing is designed.
I don't use strictly architecture as case studies either, which I think is probably one of my most exciting thoughts about architecture, is that you don't have to always look at architecture this is the key part of the process that I learned as a part of getting there. It's not like what I'm trying to do here is completely design a pragmatic apartment. I'm trying to rethink the process of designing it. So when I get a real job next year and I have to design something that's in a real world, all the stuff I've learned is basically there for me to try break the box, break the standard approach to design. It's giving you the ability to rethink what can be built, I guess.
I would love to feel that you end up with designs that look extremely different from one another. And so the way you begin is by finding your own personal heroes. And if you can find your own heroes and interrogate their architecture so that you begin to understand what it means and why it looks like that and how you can begin to design like that, it really helps. And the best way to develop your own personal signature is to build case studies from 3 different heroes and then merge them together. The way Jonathan worked is that he began with graphite on paper, and he would sketch the identity of his building from multiple points of view in elevation or section, but not in plan. And he would use those elevation or section views of sketches to first of all make sure that nothing falls down bluntly on the earth, but rather it stands on legs and has feet. That's called anthropomorphizing, where I can envision that my building has feet and a torso and a head. It has multiple components moving up, because if I don't think of it that way, I'm just going to extrude walls straight up, and then I'm back to my old box again. And I do it as sketches that allow me to sketch, say, 3 different views of the identity that is presenting it in 3 different ways as we move around the architecture. We want it to be beautiful and we want it to work. And so we need to make sure that things like the core and the big building programs are understood by us, at least as to what size, how much volume they're going to take up is what it is. Jonathan did not start with cores, but his design certainly looked like he could fit the lifts in and he could fit the stairs in. So he intuitively knew that they would work and where they would be situated. But he began with a void between his habitable spaces, and he had conceived a void to fit his structure and his service cores. And he left them as void right now. The next student is Brandon Turner, and his 5th-year thesis design for a library titled The Graveyard of Unwritten Books was generated from a short story by acclaimed Turkish author Nedim Gürsel. This short story was published in the Index on Censorship in 1996. And in understanding where it was published, you'll have a great insight into the allegorical underpinning of the story. Because the story is about censorship. It's about how authors are often so persecuted by censors that they sometimes fail to even write the book they most wish to write. The Dictionary of Imaginary Places described this book as follows. Visitors enter the graveyard of unwritten books through a narrow, gloomy gallery, which in turn leads into what appears to be a vast storeroom for books. Here, all books banned by authorities throughout the world are shut away. Some of these books were published and then forbidden. Others were stillborn. Many never reached the written page. My question to you is, how might you design a library for books that are stillborn and never reach the written page? Here's Brandon Turner to tell us what he did. So his short story is about a man who visits a library that appears to be normal, but he inadvertently stays behind after the library gets closed and realizes that there is another library below the original one that is the real library. And the library below is the library of unwritten books, books that never reached the written page. Can you walk us through and show us where we would enter?
Yeah, so you come in through this ledge in here,
which is actually the realm below. And it takes you through this like timeline of architecture coming across here, where you reach this central middle pivot point in a way. And from there, you can either return back through underground here and come up this tower, or you can continue forward towards this kind of structure here.
So if we just speak about this one realm of the drawing as a starting point, we enter a gateway, and that gateway then sets up a series of framed views. There is one threshold there leading to a second threshold with a view to a third threshold. And through that final portal, we can perceive a world beyond that we can't yet reach. And what you did was you then enabled the journey on this side of the wall to also invite someone to climb up a tower where in fact they could once again look over the wall and see the realm beyond. So the idea of places that you could see but not reach were heavily involved in your allegory of the redacted books and the censorship. You also included another tower here, which is effectively what you often refer to as a sentinel. And that sentinel is watching and regarding, while this sentinel is also watching. And this sentinel is also watching, as is this one. And as is this one. And so there's almost a voyeuristic nature to the project and to the expression of the library that you're creating, which gives it a kind of a disturbing sense of the authorities watching us, never being able to escape that purview.
Yeah, that was a big part of the short story for me, because they refer to the librarian as like a prison warden, and that librarian is all-seeing. You know, he's seeing everything that's going on in both the library above and below. So that kind of sense of voyeurism coming in the drawings was a big part of that.
And when you're allegorically representing the architecture as books in a library, as well as the architecture as being the library, there's a few devices you've used here. And one of them is this one, where we see architecture / books that are embedded in the earth and only partially visible. Here, these walls, architectural walls, are almost like pages of a book, but they're also buried fragments of architecture representing fragments of books. And so we begin to recognize that the architecture itself is being censored and only appearing as stillborn or half-born throughout this architecture. One of the other devices that I'm particularly interested in you describing is how you've made your entire contextual site become effectively a book, just like you're about to describe to us later how these architectural interventions are books. And I'll start you off by just drawing these two lines where people can see how your architecture has been opened up, hinged open, and pivoting open like a book. And as soon as those lines are gone, we begin to recognize a cover of a book over here and a cover of a book over here, and how the spine of the book is opening up and the entire landscape in that sense is then opening up. Do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, so there was a lot of it that went into play when I was designing the kind of speculative landscape. It's like there were these kind of two sections along here that, as you were saying, are opening up, becoming a book. And these kind of monolithic structures were also not just like part of the landscape, but I also envisioned them as being kind of dividers between the pages of the book. And then when you come to these fragments that were talked about before, as this whole thing is a book, those can also be seen as like the stitching or the spine of the book. I'm on the cover. And so I was envisioning this this whole thing being various representations of a book itself or just parts of a book.
And in the same sense, from an architectural point of view, you're not really distinguishing architecture from landscape. You're making them both become co-participants of one story and one entity. Wouldn't that be true?
Yeah, definitely.
And this sofa with the tree is basically providing an unexpected scale such that we recognize that there are more than one scales inhabiting this context simultaneously. But that sofa also with the tree then also contextualizes the entire project as being a library rather than simply being a series of buildings that might constitute a library, where the sofa makes us recognize that the entire space is the habitable realm of your context. And these drawings here, being your process drawings, are almost acting as witnesses of the final iteration to the left. They're being hidden by this tower, but in fact, they're right on the same axis from the arrival point to what they become as the finale point. So they're also beginning to challenge temporality and what is the beginning and what is the end, while simultaneously your drawings then become pieces of the book at a different scale that have fled from the library. So if you take us off share screen and open up the model that you used to begin this drawing and this render, where did these original forms come from?
Yeah, so these ones were built off my initial concepts, which were all representative of some form of like an unwritten book or a stillborn kind of book.
What made you decide on this particular angle for that drawing?
Well, with this one, I really liked from this side, you could see the shifting upwards as well. So you could tell there was kind of like a realm of below and above. And also the kind of cuts into the realm below and the beginning on the left-hand side kind of just work well compositionally. This is the output straight from the rendering software in Rhino. So there's various layers I put in. So I put in a lot of line work, exported separately as I can make 2D from Rhino.
Did you do the line work in Illustrator?
Yeah, so it's exported from Rhino into Illustrator, and then I put it into Photoshop. And then subtle textures in here, like on these kind of structures here, come from my overlay pack of just like a kind of rusted or like grungy kind of texture.
So for your design, this was a drawing that you considered to be the end of the preliminary design stage, where it began to establish the narrative you wanted to speak, establish it using some architectural and landscape elements that are recognizable. And so you allowed that story to enter the voice of the architect through this preliminary design speculative representation.
Yeah.
Now show us the next drawing that evolved out of that.
So this one still takes the aspects of the kind of speculative landscape, but it also integrates a real life site, which is the Rotorua carbonization plant. And it's shown as an abandoned plant, which was used back in the day for carbon farming and stuff like that. The site itself now is abandoned and it's flooded in the middle of it.
And so now we are beginning to have explained to us the purpose for you choosing that particular short story as an allegorical generator of architecture, because this is a real site in New Zealand that also has a story that is about to be lost. It's degrading into the landscape, it's overgrown, the pieces are falling down and ultimately rusting and falling into the water. It has an above ground realm and a below ground realm. And because it's overgrown and abandoned, the allegorical point of your thesis is that this is a heritage story important for New Zealand, but it's destined to be permanently lost. And can you just show us a couple of the buildings before we go back to your model that inspired particular architectural references relative to your short story?
Yeah, so the key ones I kind of referred to where I looked at a lot of the rusted ones as kind of starting points, and then I started to reinterpret some of them. The face down book is translated into that one there, and then you've got some other similar features of the site, like these bits here, and like this other one down here was implemented as one that was kind of maybe completely hidden under the water, completely submerged and disappearing. And then this kind of fluid line coming around here was a representation of the pond.
And so now you're actually making a statement with this, that you're calling this piece of New Zealand heritage a potential library or graveyard of unwritten books, where its story is destined to be redacted and lost forever.
Yep.
And you want to now explain your addition of text?
Yep. So my reasoning for that text was to, one, provide information about the drawing itself, but two, bring it back into an architectural realm. So using things like title, year, site, and stuff like that is relevant to the kind of standard architectural construction drawings. And so I was kind of looking at not only telling the viewer that there's kind of a duality in this drawing to look for, but also how the above text is actually sitting on a different kind of layer than the below text. So I'm implying that there's kind of several layers to the drawing as well. And then once the viewer can kind of understand that, it can translate it into what's going on in the middle here and realize that all these kind of buildable architectures are above and there's something going on below as well.
I noticed that there is a machine here in the corner, and that machine ultimately is engaging what appears to be a timeline. And what's interesting about that machine is that it simultaneously looks like an analog parallel rule from a drafting table, while also, in fact, it actually arises from the armatures of your architecture, doesn't it?
Yep.
So your architecture, in a sense, there on the site is the cause of the degradation of the site, while down the lower left corner, the architecture as a drafting tool is drawing the story that it's trying to tell. And then when we see that armature over here, we realize that that's the same work of architecture from your model as a drafting tool, but up above it's being shown in elevation section view, while below it's being shown in plan view. Can you explain what it is doing to the white lines?
It's what I kind of wanted to do was firstly imply a kind of sense of gravity with the wires, and then have them eventually extend out to kind of borders and edges from within the drawing, to kind of imply that this 3D perspective had once lived as a two-dimensional layer within the drawing.
And so objects of your drawing, which are effectively like wires and posts in the real context, become drawn lines in the speculative representation.
Yeah.
And here is where we both mostly notice how the line of the drawing has arisen from the suspended cables from the machine that is drawing it. Can you explain why these markers at the bottom have arrows pointing in two different directions and why they are unevenly spread?
The arrows were kind of an implication of where this kind of story opens up in a way. So in terms of the landscape, it's where the kind of two angles open up.
So it's also effectively a timeline where we see in your representation, we see the idea of time moving faster here and then almost slowing down and ultimately then disappearing completely as the white line reaches the white paper. And so that's an allegory about suspended and transforming temporality that you're engaging, while also that line is reflective from the voice of the architect as a scale line, which is also uneven and moving from one scale to another across time.
Might be a bit hard to see, but on either side, with the inclusion of a faint ledger paper, my kind of idea behind that was that the kind of corner elevation and plan views of the machine were in a way recording what happens on the site alongside this timeline through the ledger paper. And that ledger paper eventually situates itself and becomes the landscape as well.
So ledger paper is an allegory in itself for the summing up of one's life. And you discovered that allegorical idea from Brian Catley and how he uses ledger paper in his drawing. This building here appears like a book itself, but the cover of the book facing closest to us appears like it's eroding away and being redacted, while the cover further away appears more complete still. And here we begin to see how the actual buildings on this site are having the same thing happen, where they are beginning to erode away and rust and fall and decay. And so some of their facades are still intact while others are not. And you began to represent that as your buildable architectural intervention on your speculative site.
Yep.
Are you able to show us the models of your architecture as books for an explanation?
So these were all kind of investigations of different ways to represent like an unwritten book or a stillborn book or a redacted book. So with this one, like you've got the fragmented cover as the facade, exposing the kind of inner structural framework. And then at the back here, you've got the staircase, which becomes the binding on the spine of the book. I mean, I've gone with a dual scissor stair kind of design to lead people to both sides of the book, where one side could be exposed to this kind of framework with natural light for public spaces, and the other one could be led to this kind of more enclosed, maybe private spaces as well.
So as a library, you might, for instance, have all the stacks in the left-hand side and the reading rooms on the right-hand side. So you used a double scissor stair specifically to emulate the stitching on the binding of a book.
Yep.
And so what you've been doing is incorporating stairs, required fire stairs, structural elements, balconies, etc. Each one redesigned as a conceptual device that's an allegory, but simultaneously enabling your building to actually function and meet code.
Yep, exactly.
So you've purposely disengaged each one of these architectural elements from the landscape while simultaneously importing it from kind of a pedestal structure below, so that it doesn't just look like a rectangular building, but in fact appears to hover above the landscape as an other element. And the machine below is simply allegorical. It's the device below that is meant to be the dark library that is pulling and redacting and tearing apart the books as just part of your metaphor. So there's actually an entirely new, different building on the below realm versus the above realm.
I ended up doing a render of that one as well. And when I was looking at it, my kind of idea was to imply that the machine below in this realm was kind of manipulating the landscape and shaping the kind of topography which is forming the library above.
You eventually built a model that was exhibited at the Academy of Fine Arts, where that image we just saw was being shown above the model, such that it was almost an inversion of the concept, where the below ground is now being shown above and the above ground being shown below.
So the model has several layers of acrylic cut with basically a plan view printout of the machine on the bottom. And so those layers also become a book in themselves with like the binding at the back here.
What's the most beautiful to me about this model is that from this point of view, it definitely is recognizable as a buildable, habitable work of architecture. But the entire model also looks like a book that is in the process of opening up and losing its pages. So the allegory is particularly well fulfilled, I think, in this three-dimensional model, and particularly when we recognize the model itself is a speculative drawing. It's what Tom Main and Brian Cantley call grottos, which are combinations of drawing and model together. Brandon, thanks very much. It was great having you explain that to everyone.
Sure. Thank you.
In the next student seminar, Rory Patterson took on board the re-presentation of an award-winning science fiction film by Soviet director Andrei Tarkovsky called Stalker. This film depicts a search for identity within the realm of the deep subconscious. In this film, an illegal dive leads a writer and a scientist in search of the room, which lies at the very center of the zone. These three characters represent the three sides of self: the spiritual, the creative, and the rational. How might you design an architectural representation of the search for identity within the subconscious self? Rory Patterson designed a six-sided architectural context model folded into a three-dimensional box that holds the deep subconscious within. Here's Rory Patterson to tell us what he did. Rory, you began by looking at architectural case studies by Raymond Abraham and Hans Tiederscholl with the intention of designing an allegorical journey for each of the three sides of self that were personified in the Tarkovsky film. The writer as the creative side of self, the professor as the logical side of self, and the stalker, or shepherd as he was known, as the spiritual side of self. But there was also a fourth important character in Tarkovsky's film, the crippled child. Her side of self is incomplete, not yet fully formed. Rory, as an exemplar, tell us how you started representing the professor as a set of architectural thresholds arranged as a pathway in life.
This was a set that I constructed for the professor character, which was the side of self focused on logic, mainly.
In terms of allegory, you decided to create a linear pathway for each of the sides of self. Each pathway would take that particular side of self through shadow into light, descending, ascending, various allegorical stages until they ultimately met one another at the crossing where the four pathways intersect.
Exactly. The whole premise of the film is that these characters are on not only a journey together, but a journey individually in their own sort of growth. I guess the professor, so for the professor, the 5 key words that I was looking at: destruction, observer, resurrection, paralysis, and subterranean.
You then selected an abstract painting by German artist Kurt Schwitters as the site for the three architectural journeys.
I was kind of looking at, I guess, a lot of stuff around the film Stalker, and I came across this dude who was working, I guess, in post-World War I Germany with like a lot of like collage stuff. And what I found quite interesting about that was how he, I guess, picked up like scraps and like forgotten little pieces off the streets and the ruins of that area at the time, and then used them in his work, which was something I guess I drew from my provocateur with Tarkovsky, kind of like working with all of those like ruins and little bits of glass or like poems and stuff that he shows in some of the slow motion scenes in that film.
So this painting, to some degree, represented a forbidden zone to you, but as an abstraction of the elements collected by Stalker in the film, as well as by Tarkovsky as the director in making it.
I chose this one basically because it had a lot of interesting shapes on it, quite like orthographic shapes. If I was kind of imagining it as like a plan view, I could sort of take some of the sketches and like the initial models that I had done and arrange them to line up with different aspects of the painting.
And so what did you add to the painting?
So I took like a plan view of one of my sketch models, this here, and overlaid it on, I guess, some of those like little orthographic details. And then I think at the end stage, I arranged it so it had corridors, because you've got one there, and then I had another copy of it going off that way, and another copy of it going off that way, just to kind of like really put it into the canvas itself. So it was like almost feeling like it was part of it.
So these were planned views of your early experiments that you situated onto the painting canvas.
The next bit of the process was basically just grayscaling the image. And the point of doing that, I guess, was I had been using this website, which is called Image to STL. So basically what that was doing, you can upload a file and it'll generate a 3D mesh based on the height map in the image. You can say, okay, I want all of the black pixels to be the 0 point of this mesh. And then as you move up through the scale of the gradient of color, or the gradient of shade, bump the white pixels up to the top. So you have like a range of stuff coming through. You can just upload it in, press convert. This is basically what it pumps out. So you get like a 3D geometrized mesh, which is based on like pixels. So it's quite jagged. I put together just this Blender file. So that's got all of my, I guess, process in it. This is kind of, I guess, what it begins to look like when you start playing with the mesh. So you can kind of play around, you can scale it to push out sort of that verticality quite a bit, or like drag it down almost so it's very flat. And then so that one, which was all smoothed out, and then kind of started overlaying those initial exploratory models into the position which they had been on the painting canvas. So this one here was basically a very similar principle. So I was still using the same mesh with the architectural model. But what I had done, I had cut out like a small box of it, so a little flint almost. And then I had taken pieces of the building, like these sectional cuts here where you get a breakaway at the side and you get sort of interesting geometries and elements. And I had taken that and booleaned the side of this cube out using those elements. So you're getting almost a negative of the house itself on each side of the model, something where you're experiencing different parts of the house semi-simultaneously and that kind of thing, while also creating, I felt like a very interesting sort of exhibition piece. One of the things that I wanted to incorporate was sort of, I guess, a bit more multimedia, something to, I guess, guide the viewer in their interpretation of the object itself. So a way that I came up with, which is sort of a subtle form of guiding for the, I guess, the visual perspective of the viewer, was to incorporate pieces of text. So I had some quotes, one from my film provocateur and one from a reading, an architectural reading that I had done. And basically what I did was I didn't want to present them as a singular piece of text which is visible all on one face, because that was, I guess, the antithesis of the point of the model. You need to travel around it and view it from all of these different perspectives and then kind of generate like a holistic interpretation of the piece rather than having it be viewed specifically from one angle. So what I basically did this is I just split the quotes up into two at this point. So I had them positioned on the corners. So when you are reading them, your eye to actually read them as the full quote, you would need to travel around the corner, and the sentence will continue on onto the other side of the model. However, one thing that I did do was I kind of chopped the quote a bit and sort of arranged it so that it would be legible and kind of understandable within a different context if you viewed it from just one side. So you could kind of take little bits of the words and text and sort of break them so that you can make semi-coherent sentences which kind of change the meaning of the quote when you view it on this one plane, whereas when you view it on the double plane, you get the full interpretation of that. And so I repeated that, I guess, on this side as well here with that other quote from the reading. I think one of the criticisms or the constructive criticisms that I have received from you at the beginning phase of the design of this model was that it would be really good if there was more of an interaction between the different faces in terms of lines and geometries or trajectories kind of traveling between the faces and connecting with each other to form, I guess, new paths through the 3D space. And then, yeah, really just trying to streamline and keep that model nice and clear for CNC, which I guess was the next phase of 100.
You described the top surface as being derived from the painting and the sides as being derived from the opposition to the painting. And what were the other three sides derived from?
I was taking a section of the mesh and doing out the side in respect with the corridor that was linked to the different character. You can sort of see, I guess, that reverse mold of like the corridors coming through in these aspects. So you get the different sort of, I guess, typologies almost coming through. And the main thing, I guess, from these ones where they were all Booleans. So I had created the geometry for the architecture, but for this model, the phases of it were actually, I guess, the negative. So where the initial model had, I guess, like a structure, like a beam or a post or a column or something like that, it would be a void within the face of the model. And then the void on the initial model would be a mass on this model.
So the theoretical intention, in fact, was to begin to articulate a manifest architecture that was defined both by its solids and by its voids, and to interrogate how the solids and voids were simultaneously defining the context within which the architecture was situated, so that the void of one became the solid of another and back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think remembering back, I think a lot of that was sort of, I guess, drawn from my provocateur in terms of, I guess, the allegory that came from it, where they are delving into sort of the undiscovered sides of themselves, or, you know, placing themselves in dialogue with other characters, which change their perspectives. So in Tarkovsky's film, basically the premise is that they go on this journey to this place called the Zone, which is sort of I guess like a miasmic sort of undefined place where everything is in motion and shifting and very I guess unpredictable almost.
You're designing a house for the four sides of self, which in fact are one self on a journey that occurs in multiple dimensions and multiple directions. And you're trying to show that architecture in a three-dimensional model around which we must walk in order to discover the interrelationship of the four sides of self. Another one of your intentions is, in fact, to take on the notion of a speculative drawing as a speculative model, so that while in a speculative architectural drawing, typically we might see architecture represented at multiple scales, multiple temporal points, and multiple orientations simultaneously. You're doing that with a three-dimensional model, and the temporality has to do with us walking around it. while seeing the multiple views, orientations, and scales simultaneously.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next step, I guess, from here was I needed to, obviously, I had been working in digital for this entire time pretty much, but I needed to produce this for the exhibition, which was a big undertaking. So I needed to use the big CNC cutter to generate this model and carve it out of material in real life. So I split the model using Booleans just on each face. So I guess what I did here, just Booleaned them out and then arrayed them all on a really large sheet of gold foam, like the biggest pretty much one you could buy. One of the problems that I did run into, the CNC actually went through the sheet of the foam. So I had a lot of voids which you could see through into the middle of the model, but it enabled me to design a interior space inhabited the model itself.
That also goes closely in line with the conclusion and the climax of the film Stalker, and the search for the center by the vorticides itself was actually meant to symbolize the soul. You were able to have an architecture within an architecture, having the holes appear.
That transformed the model almost into a piece of architecture itself with an inhabitable interior. You did have these, I guess, interesting copies of the geometry on the outside, which extruded onto the inside, which sort of formed a replica of the original model itself. I guess because you're using a reverse on the outside, you're getting the original on the inside. So my initial idea was to kind of take these geometries and extrude them into the center from all four sides so that they were, I guess, colliding with each other and sort of forming new spaces, which were a combination of all four sides itself.
So this really is a complex viewing of a three-dimensional speculative drawing where you can see drawing inside and outside.
That was what the inside of the mesh itself looked like when I was designing the model. So you've got, I guess, those elements from the outside which are transferring onto the inside, and then I was bringing those into the center, and same for there. Just got some sort of interesting little staircases and stuff which are reflecting in. So that would be, I guess, a kind of a view from the inside there. So you're starting to get sort of, I guess, a bit of an inhabitable sort of space emerging.
And then you use the laser cutter to add additional elements to it once you had it to that stage.
Yeah, so I guess what I took was these basic forms and these shapes, which I had extruded. And then I think the grids also kind of gave me a way to differentiate three sort of different levels within the interior, taking it back to those three characters or three sides of itself. And this is kind of what it ended up looking like once I had inserted that top piece. That's sort of me spray brushing the interior face, created these three different floors and three different architectural conditions within the interior itself, as well as the exterior. And then, yeah, that's the front face. So you can see a bit more of that. You can see that obviously those are the voids which CNC had cut out. They provide this really awesome opportunity to create sort of a window into the internal world of the model. I guess this is it in its position in the gallery itself. So the thing was, we wanted it on, I guess, the center line of the gallery so that people could walk around it, because that was the whole point of the installation. That's me against the model. So it is 1 meter high at its highest point, so it would meet the visual sightline of reaching the bottom of the other exhibition works.
All of the other works in the exhibition had dystopian allegorical themes to them. So you positioned yours specifically so that it lived within the underworld beneath the level of the other components.
I like that.
And they were two-dimensional, forming the four sides of a space, while yours was three-dimensional, being the core inside, effectively reproducing the zone in Stalker from that point of view of the whole gallery space. And this soul.
And I guess even then you've got the little room inside the center of the room as well.
Rory, thanks very much.
Oh, no worries. It's a pleasure, Daniel.
The next student is Caleb Skeen, and his fifth-year thesis design is titled The House at the End of Time.
So this here is my thesis, The House at the End of Time. The literary provocation behind my thesis was of the same name, an article called The House at the End of Time, written by architect and academic Peter Schneider. And Schneider reflects on this house as being an allegorical portrait of inner life or a memory archive. And though it is the house at the end of time, this cannot exist without the house at the beginning. So through analysing this text, I pulled out inspirational prompts and brought these all together into a framework that my entire design process reflects back on. Whilst extracting these written prompts from the text, I would be sketching and trying to come up with ideas and understandings, interpretations of my own. And finally, I would create these superimposed speculative drawings. And then beyond that, the speculative drawing would then inspire the next drawing iterations. And I was really taken and showcased in these sketches to the right by this idea of a portrait of inner life, and that the house itself would contain the memories of the occupant, so that the house itself might take on this machinic form of a drawing device and be physically itself, marking out real space and capturing memory in real time. A key case study to this was architect Tom Main's project for the Cape Mantilini restaurant, where he had a machinic device housed within the finished building, which was inscribing on the floor its own floor plan, so sort of an intention cycle of itself. And I was really captured by this and wanting to utilize or consider the house itself as a drawing device. Overlaid and fragments of surfaces, memories, and architectural notations present the house as a dynamic, sentient entity traversing the temporal continuum, with a cyclical timeline manifested in the below realm. I thought would be key to see this process of the dwelling itself, inscribing and marking, drawing in the underworld, in the darkness, and that then evolved into the 3D form of the architectural side of the house at the end of time, for me, where there's this machinic drawing device captured within the space, within the house, and it's siphoning this memory ink from the above realm and archiving and documenting life lived.
I think it would really help for them to know why you did a project called The House at the End of Time. Caleb was born with cystic fibrosis, which means that he himself recognized that his lifespan might perhaps be shorter than others. And in New Zealand, the medication that was most needed to assist was not available until the year of his thesis. And so his thesis started without that medication being available and ended with it being available. And the form upon which he based the house at the end of time is a rectangular, squarish form that simultaneously with the same proportions as the childhood bedroom and the hospital room he spent most of his life in. And this house at the end of time is based on that footprint. The point of his thesis was that the house at the end of time is moving across a temporal trajectory to the end. And when it reached the end, that was the end of his thesis, where in fact, all of you, when you finish your university education, that life you have lived will end. And you will then enter a new life and move in a new direction. And his whole project is about reaching the house at the end of time and then entering upon a new beginning, a new direction for the future. The house at the end of time above, touching on the mirror. But what's beautiful here is that we then see the same image in plan view in one orientation and an elevation view in another, before it then moves into the darkness. And here it is in sectional view. And so he's showing the identity of the house, the identity of self, in multiple points of view at the same time as it moves on its temporal trajectory, meaning that the temporality is not linear. Temporality is layered and cyclical and evolving and spiraling and recrossing its own path.
This work was presented at a gallery setting at an exhibition that we hosted. And it was the first time that I really put my work out there into a public setting. It was one thing for me to be within a safe space, so to speak, talking with Daniel and my peers and bringing out my story into architectural form. The closing of a chapter and the opening of a new one in the cyclical time frame that I was so fixated on didn't have to mean a birth and a death. It was, we go through so many cycles through life. And I think that was a really key thing that came out of my work into that, not only for me, but I was able to give forward through architecture. So in the distance is the drawing that we've just seen, and that is the end of time. So it's caught in this dark, ominous cloud, rotating back. The architecture is presenting itself on the timeline, and it's there in reality and flesh. Whereas as the occupant is essentially sitting at this table at the opposite end of time at the beginning, weaving the lifeline and tracing the drawing above through physical thread that I spent countless hours and very many late nights weaving myself through the process. So I was very taken by the mythology of the three fates of time, who were set to spin the lifeline, and the next would measure it out to discern how long of a life you'll lead. And the last, which is presented here by the secateurs, the top of frame, was the end of time, who would essentially end your life. So it's caught on a silk sheet, and it's black thread tracing my lifespan. And I printed photos of my life as mnemonic devices through this piece as well, to try and show the two in dialogue together. So one's in a state of birth and the other's in a state of decay.
And that stitched drawing is the identical scale of the actual drawing on the wall.
Yes.
So it's almost like a trace. And Caleb, there's another drawing I'd like you to talk about too, because I think it's important that students see the wealth of drawings for the same topic of how many ways it can be expressed.
So this here is the underlying narrative of my health and cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is a disease that affects the lungs predominantly. It makes it very hard to breathe. So what this scene is capturing here is an X-ray of my lungs in a still moment in time, right before I began my new medication. So it's almost the closing of one chapter, the end of time. And this drawing itself, or the X-ray, has then become the site for the House at the End of Time, which you can just see faintly above in the darkness, above the redacted lines, peering up above and looking onto the distance. And so I was using these same methods of speculative drawing and notation devices to try and bring that narrative together. So there's the smaller, more distinct X-ray of my lungs in the bottom right, and my last hospital band running vertically. And then this drawing itself ended up becoming the floor plan of the House at the End of Time that I ended my thesis with as well. So it was sort of a cycle, or an inception, as I like to think of it, on itself, consistently iterating and developing through and through and through. But
I thought Caleb was very brave because he was identifying who he was and putting it out there. And he didn't have to put it in words, but this is how he was seeing himself at that time and capturing his own identity through the voice of architecture. And whoops. And thanks very much. That was the 4 students that I wanted to have you hear their own stories from their own voices, which I think is the most beautiful way to hear a student's design discussed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, very impressive work. And I don't know, would you be open to having a few questions?
Absolutely. And also Caleb Skeen, the last student, is here in the audience. So if anyone wants to ask Caleb some questions, there he is. He's in Rome right now as an artist in residence.
Wow, great to have you, Caleb.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, maybe I could start with a question. You seem are the work of your students seems very agile in terms of techniques, right? Seeing things from Rhino modeling, Illustrator uh, to this image interpreter that that interpreted the painting, um, to going to, you know, an X-ray of a lung. How do you handle as a teacher, how do you handle techniques that you might not be like accustomed to, or, you know, it
Yep.
seems like new things are being brought to the table all the time, especially now we have a lot of new tools in terms of AI, et cetera. Um, how do you handle that? How do you
Yeah,
dialogue with that?
yeah, that's a really important question because there's no way the teachers can learn all the softwares that the students are using. And I suppose the most important thing, I sit with the students as you would so often that I watch what they're doing on their machines. So I know what different softwares are capable of doing, even though I don't know how to drive myself. And in that sense, I can, number one, advise them what software to look at, but number two, advise them, more importantly, what student to go ask for guidance in how to use it. And I think that's what's the first most important thing. The second is that when I collect stories like this and put them out in the public realm, I think the most important thing that happens is that students recognize that they can raise the bar. They have never thought of doing certain things or using certain softwares or approaching a project in a certain way. And when they have seen other students who are really dedicated and skillful achieve these, then they go and try to find the same softwares, try to use them, but then also try to raise the bar above that student. And Caleb agrees with me. Caleb was a big climber of trying to raise the bar, and he was in a large group of thesis students who were always competing with one another for who would do the most incredible project. And I think that's fundamentally important, is for the students to have enough passion personally in a group that they want to inspire one another and talk to one another.
Mhm. Do you think do you think that, you know, the fact that these projects don't necessarily look to, you know, satisfy, I don't know, code or functions or functionality, et cetera, does that liberate them to sort of, ex you know, play with the representation more and not be so worried about detailing things correctly, or
I tried to, especially in the first two projects, I tried to show that these projects were all capable of moving into realizable architecture. But the real point of doing a project like this as a student in school is to teach yourself how to not make architecture that looks normative or generic, how to think outside the box. And so it's that training mechanism that I think is the most important about projects like this. But as you notice, I made sure with Jonathan's in the beginning that I began by talking about how it invoked mechanical systems and structural systems, because this criticism is so often directed at projects like this that it's important just to kill that notion at the beginning by saying that it's always going to be important to recognize those things. The way I describe it to students, and I think Caleb will agree with this as well, is that when you're learning architecture, in the first year or two, you've learned how to juggle maybe 3 balls. And one of them might be structures, one of them might be space planning. And this project is about teaching you how to add 2, 3, or 4 more balls into your juggling. But that does not mean that you should drop the first 3 balls. It means that you need to keep them intuitively in the back of your head. You need to be at a stage in your education where you understand what the volume needs to be to enable the program to exist, what the project's proportions need to be to enable it to structurally stand up, and then challenge the norm. Do not extrude the box. If a restaurant wants to be horizontal, design it as a vertical. Do the opposite to see just what would happen. Caleb, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think you summed it up very well. It's just that key thing, I suppose, that everything, no matter how far out or abstract things can get in the way of lateral thinking, you've always got your core principles, or the three balls, as Daniel's put it, at the core of architecture that it comes back to. But it allows you to reach out that further part and experiment.
Caleb, there's a question on the chat from Lana. Do you want to answer it?
Sure.
Perfect. Yeah. If anyone else has a question, also raise your hands, and we're right in the comment section in the chat.
Yeah, so this, say for instance, the 4 projects that were presented here, including mine, were over the span of a year for the one master's thesis. But I think what Daniel was about to say, that there's a lot that goes into it in the year prior in the way of planning, but it's holistically overtaken over 1 year.
I think what really happens with me is that, like, I taught Caleb in his year 3, his year 4, and his year 5.
Yeah.
So we got to know how each other speaks. He was very used to me always speaking in metaphors. I never used the word room or window or door. I always talked about torsos and people and animals, and you get used to that after a while. But it also, then he began to learn to read certain things that he might never have read before. And we entered into a vocabulary, which was fantastic. So it takes a while to learn it. But his final thesis for all these students was probably 9 months total. It takes a couple months at the beginning to figure out what it is you want to do, and a couple months at the end to kind of bring it to a conclusion and an examination. And it's probably 9 months at most for the whole thing to come into being. There's a wonderful question in Spanish, or statement, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Augustine has a question.
Yeah, Agustin.
Hi, everybody. Writing from Mexico. Just wanted to ask, looking at the projects, I see references, and I wanted to ask if it's a given reference in the for the students, or is just a coincidence in terms of the expressivity and the graphics and the models. And the references are, for me, like Hans Hollein, Gunther Domenig, Kopp Himmelblau, and all this Austrian group from the 80s, 90s, which is amazing. I worked for them a couple of years in Austria for Domenig and Kopp Himmelblau, and remind me a lot all the graphics you show and the models.
I think you're a very lucky man. And I was educated at that period, which is why I was introduced to them. But during the 80s and 90s, there was extraordinary architecture happening. And when I said to the audience here that it's important for students to talk to one another and raise the bar amongst each other, the most important first step is for us to, as educators, to introduce students to these great masters, the ones who are not traditional, like Hans Hollein, and to begin to show the students how much depth there is in the architectural works of these incredible architects, so the students themselves become literate. It's the hardest thing for a student to learn how to read a work of architecture, to find the meaning. And once you have taught the student how to do that, they will be able to read drawings and architecture ever since. And that's why in these 4 talks, I always make sure to tell everyone what the architects were, who they were that inspired certain directions, because it is so important to give credit, and it is so important to stand on the shoulders of these earlier architects and build from them and increase what they were doing and celebrate what they were doing.
Great, thanks. It's amazing, beautiful work.
Thank you.
I
think Caleb would say that most of his heroes are about to give lectures in your series, Lucas.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, we'd like to invite you to also, Caleb, at some point.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd be honored.
Come to Mexico, please.
If
May I come to Mexico?
If you're around, we can take you to Augustine's wine bar.
Oh,
It sounds too good.
Yes.
Does anyone else have a question? ¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta? I wrote in Spanish there if people want
Yeah.
help translate. Daniel?
Sam,
Hello. Thank you, Daniel, for the lecture. It was really good. I'm an architecture student from Colombia, and I just wanted to ask, what would be the main difference between an allegorical process that comes from an object or a machine and an allegorical process from narrative media like text or films?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that question by, when I teach this methodology, I introduce students to a wide range of allegorical opportunities. With most of them, it's a combination of understanding how the machine is already an allegory, but understanding how, Rory used a film, Jonathan used a sacred object, and Brandon used a short story. All of these, it's beautiful, all of these disciplines of design are capable of telling a story over time. And architecture, when it is designed, often treats itself as being static, just an object on a site. So if we ask ourselves, why is architecture never challenged to take on the opportunities that drama and ballet and music and literature and film can take on easily? That's the big, most important thing for students to recognize. And architecture is possible to take that on, because when we arrive at the outside of a building, we see its first identity. When we pass through a building, we see additional new identities. When we leave at the opposite end and look back again, we suddenly see the final identity and we recognize the entire narrative that we walked through. So architecture is a temporal experiential field of discipline, just like film, just like machines, just like literature. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Here has another question in the chat. How to make sure what I draw represents exactly what I mean, and how do I make others understand it without explaining? I have a hard time learning how to transform my abstract thought into something physical.
That is a great question from a random guy on the internet. It is another hard thing, and I think Caleb found that difficult as well. Oftentimes, when students struggle to read strong architectural drawings and projects, they believe that it is all just a cloud that is not meant to be understood. And that is not true. Architecture and the drawings must be understandable. So if you are doing a drawing that needs to be explained verbally, then you have not succeeded to the level you must succeed. I would say, I often use the metaphor of a Shakespeare play, where when Shakespeare wrote his plays, he always had these low-key body plots moving through for one class of people watching the play, for the common person. But he had very intellectual plots going through for the educated population. And that should be true of all of our work. We should enable our projects to be recognized by everybody that there is something happening there. I clearly see that there is something meaningfully happening. And I may not know what that is, but an architect will know what it is. And that's what the voice of the architect is. And that's why we all need to perfect our literacy as architects so that we can read these and understand them. Caleb, how would you answer that question? How did you find you were able to make your architecture meaningful rather than just abstract and blurry and
Yeah, I think I following on from what you said, I definitely fell victim, shall I say, to the desire to create obscurity, I suppose, was that I was getting lost in the cloud that Daniel was saying, the haze, so to speak, and thinking that that was the truth behind showing work of this nature. But the more I got into it, and the more you're saying, you almost extend your vocabulary, for lack of a better word, in the design sense, and pulling references into the work at all times, whether they're visual or written, I think is a big one. A key thing for my work, I think, was intertextual referencing. So trying to bring in various works of different natures into the frame, into the story. Hopefully that helps.
No, it does. And it's, for me, I believe that every line we put on a drawing should be there for a reason, locked in place and be meaningful. And so that's how we learn how to do this, is by asking ourselves, can that line be moved or changed? And if it can, then it's not meaningful, and put in something that is.
Well, that's a good rule of thumb.
Also, I'll just end with one last issue about intertextual references that Caleb mentioned, because that's really important. And it's about us all making sure that we are educated individuals. As an example, in Caleb's talk, when I put in the word the mirror on the line between the house at the beginning of time above and the house at the end of time below, that was an intertextual reference for Caleb about Narcissus, looking at his own reflection in the pond of water. And so when we know things about literature and painting and mythologies, we can begin to hint at them so that other people recognize those mythologies and references when they see the drawing, and then they find even more meaning in it. And one of the issues I would really love to end with, because this talk is happening in Mexico. Mexico has such an incredibly strong culture of original indigenous mythologies, as well as colonial mythologies that have arrived at the same time. And if the students can find their own signature and their own identity, they can design an architecture that not only is not a normative box, but in fact looks Mexican, looks like it is from the heart and the soul of your culture, rather than being taken from modernism, which arose in Europe and came over and has eaten up the entire world. Find your voice, because it is there, and it's a beautiful, beautiful voice.
Great advice. Yeah, we'll take it into heart. Well, I guess then we'll leave it there. There were a few extra questions, but maybe they can shoot you an email.
Okay, that'd be great. Or on my Instagram, which is probably
or Instagram. Okay, great. So, well, thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, Caleb, for also participating in the discussion. Thank you, everyone, for connecting. We were happy to have everyone. I mean, I saw a lot of names that, of course, of our students, but also from other places. So I'm glad that we were able to convene here. And so you're all welcome to continue in the series, and the posters are online. And well, yeah, thank you very much. So I'll call this a conclusion to the talk.
And Lucas, you'll be uploading the recording at some point.
I will be uploading the recording to a YouTube channel, and I will post that as well on my Instagram. So
great.
Go ahead and follow me at Conscientious Observer or Archepisteme or arc.tech.cro, which is our school, our department Instagram. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, everyone.